It was just another morning at the corner of Pine and Elm, where the familiar hum of cars passing by echoed through the streets. The children of Oak Ridge Elementary had gathered at the crosswalk, chattering and laughing as they waited for the signal. Among them stood Mr. Daniels, the quiet crossing guard, his reflective vest gleaming under the early sun. His steady, silent gaze scanned the street, as it had every morning for the last 5 years. To the kids, he was a mere fixture part of the routine, nothing special. They called him Old Man Daniels when they thought he wasn't listening, and joked about how he probably couldn't even remember the last time he'd run. The younger ones laughed as they mimicked his slow, deliberate movements, exaggerating his every step. A few of the bolder kids tossed pennies at his feet when they thought no one was watching. It wasn't that they hated him. It was simply that he was a target for their boredom, a symbol of the mundane. As the light turned green, the children scampered across the street without a second thought, but not before throwing one last smirk in Mr. Daniels' direction. They didn't understand him. To them, he was just an old man doing a job that anyone could do, a job that in their eyes was beneath him. He had no family, no friends who visited, and no stories to tell. At least none they could imagine. He was just there every day in the same spot, with the same calm expression, and the kids in their youthful arrogance saw no reason to treat him any differently than they would an old tree or a lamppost, just part of the scenery. But as they crossed one of them, a tall, lanky boy named Jake couldn't resist one last jab. "Hey, Daniels, think you'll ever get a real job?" he called, laughing. It was a harmless comment or so, Jake thought. Mr. Daniels didn't react. He never did. But the kids would soon learn in the most unexpected of ways that there was much more to this quiet crossing guard than met the eye. For weeks, the kids of Oak Ridge Elementary walked the same path, to school crossing the street with the same routine every day. And every day Mr. Daniels was there, a constant in their lives, standing at the same intersection, his reflective vest standing out against the backdrop of the bustling morning traffic. He was the quiet sentinel of the block, watching over the children as they went about their business. No different from the previous day, his movements were deliberate and methodical, the way his gloved hand would raise the stop sign, the way his body slightly swayed in the breeze as he stood sentinel. He was a man of few words, preferring the silence to the chatter of the children as they filed across the street. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, he just didn't engage in their juvenile games. It seemed as though the world had passed him by, and all he had left was this small stretch of pavement where he stood day after day, greeting the children with a quiet nod, even when they ignored him. The kids began to predict his routine like clockwork. Jake, the leader of the group, was always the first one to cross. His smirk remained plastered on his face as he gave a quick glance at Mr. Daniels, who would barely acknowledge him. The group would follow suit, chattering loudly, pushing each other around as they jostled to be the first to the other side. But Mr. Daniels never flinched. No matter how loud or obnoxious the kids got, he simply remained steady, watching them as they rushed across. There was something almost comforting in his unshakable consistency. It didn't matter how many days passed, Mr. Daniels would always be there. The children came to expect it almost like a rite of passage as they crossed the street. It became a game for them. How many days could they walk by without acknowledging the man who stood there unmoving, uncomplaining, and always the same? There was, however, one rule they learned quickly. Don't run in front of Mr. Daniels. Despite his quiet demeanor, he was still a stickler for safety. If one of them ever darted into the street too quickly, he would raise his hand sharply, signaling for them to stop. The kids, reluctant as they were to follow any adult's orders, would begrudgingly halt their steps. But even that became part of the routine. Mr. Daniels would stop them. They'd roll their eyes and then continue walking as if nothing had happened. It was a cycle predictable, safe, and thoroughly boring. What none of them knew as they carried on with their mockery and games was that something was about to break the pattern, something far bigger than any of them could ever have imagined. They'd never seen the man's life for what it was. They'd never looked past the quiet exterior. But that day, everything was about to change. It was a typical Thursday morning, the air cool and crisp as the kids gathered at the crosswalk, talking over each other with their usual banter. Jake was leading the charge, as always a smug grin on his face, as he watched the others try to keep up. Mr. Daniels stood in his usual spot, barely registering the noise around him. The world had always moved in this rhythm, children laughing, cars honking, and the quiet crossing guard doing his job almost like a ghost in the backdrop. Nothing ever really changed, and the kids took full advantage of that. But today something felt different. There was an unusual hum in the air, a low, vibrating sound that caught Jake's attention. He paused mid-sentence, looking up, trying to place the source. The others followed suit, glancing around in confusion. It wasn't the typical noise of the city. It felt like something was coming. The sound grew louder, clearer, almost deafening as the sky overhead darkened, blotting out the sunlight for just a moment. The kids looked up in unison, their chatter quieting into uneasy silence. And then out of nowhere, a massive jet soared over their heads, its engines roaring as it passed. The sheer force of the sound left them stunned, causing their bodies to tremble under the shockwave. Jake's mouth fell open, the usual cocky swagger drained from his face. The jet sleek and powerful. A deep military gray seemed to be coming directly over them, its presence ominous. The sight was jarring like something out of a movie, but this wasn't a movie. This was real, and it was happening right above them. The kids scrambled to pull their heads back down from the sky, their hearts racing. The roar of the jet filled the air for a few moments longer before it began to fade into the distance, disappearing over the horizon. For a moment, the world was still. And then without warning, a deep, almost mechanical voice broke the silence, emerging from the stillness like a thunderclap. "All clear," the voice announced, cutting through the air, its calmness unsettling. The voice didn't belong to anyone in the vicinity, and the suddenness of it sent chills through their bodies. It was so matter-of-fact, as if this event was just another day on the job. The children turned in confusion to Mr. Daniels, wondering if he'd seen the same thing they had. But there he stood, unmoving as always, his eyes on the horizon. His expression remained unchanged. It was as if the flyover, the roar of the jet, the voice, none of it was unexpected to him. The kids stood there trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. They were used to quiet mornings, the regular hum of the world around them. But this was anything but ordinary. Jake, still frozen in place, couldn't help but ask the question that had been swirling in his mind. "Mr. Daniels? What was that? Why didn't you?" But before he could finish, Mr. Daniels spoke for the first time that day, his voice low, calm, and deliberate. That was just a reminder. He said, his gaze still focused on the sky. A reminder that there's more going on than you can see from here. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The kids stared at him, unsure of what he meant, but one thing was clear. Something had changed. The world had shifted from ordinary to something far more complicated, and Mr. Daniels, the quiet crossing guard, who'd once seemed so simple, had just dropped a bombshell that no one was prepared for. The jet may have passed overhead, but it left behind a question that none of them could answer. What did Mr. Daniels know, and why had he been so calm about it? The answer, it seemed, was still unfolding, and it was bigger than any of them could imagine. The tension lingered in the air long after the jet had disappeared over the horizon. The kids stood in silence, each of them still processing the strange event. The quiet hum of the city seemed to return to normal, but the unease remained like a lingering cloud in the sky. They glanced nervously at each other, and then back at Mr. Daniels, who had yet to say anything more. His usual placid expression was now harder to read than ever. Jake, still shaking from the shock of the flyover, felt a mix of awe and confusion. He'd always thought Mr. Daniels was just a regular, albeit quiet, crossing guard, but now there was something undeniably off about the man, something different. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Daniels was somehow connected to what had just happened. But how? As if reading Jake's thoughts, Mr. Daniels finally spoke, his voice calm, yet laced with something that sent another shiver down Jake's spine. "There's more to this than you'll ever know," he said quietly. "Things aren't always as simple as they seem." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The words were cryptic, yet somehow familiar. It was as if Mr. Daniels was finally giving them a glimpse into a side of him they'd never imagined, a side they hadn't even known existed. Before anyone could react, another sound broke through the stillness, this time the faint rumble of distant engines. The kids froze again, their heads snapping toward the source. But it wasn't the roar of a jet this time. It was something different, something closer, and the sound was growing louder by the second. Within moments, the unmistakable hum of a helicopter cut through the air, followed by the sharp whirl of its blades as it descended quickly, almost too quickly. The helicopter landed in a small clearing just off the street, its rotors kicking up dust and debris in all directions. The kids' jaws dropped, their eyes wide as they watched the aircraft touch down, the noise deafening. Daniels didn't flinch. He simply stood, his eyes still on the horizon, as if this were all part of the plan. The door to the helicopter swung open, and a tall figure in a sleek black suit emerged, stepping onto the ground, with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The man was all business, his demeanor calm but authoritative. Without missing a beat, he walked toward Mr. Daniels, who without a word stepped aside to allow him through. The kids were frozen, unsure whether to speak, to move, or even to breathe. The sight before them was surreal, like something ripped from a spy movie, and they had no idea what was happening. The man in the suit finally turned to the kids, his gaze sweeping over them as though evaluating each one. "You should go inside," he said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. "This is no place for children." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Daniels raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "He's right," he said quietly, his voice holding an unexpected weight. "It's time for you to go." The kids hesitated for a moment, the confusion and fear swirling in their minds, but something in Mr. Daniels' eyes told them that it wasn't a request. It was an order. Reluctantly, they began to walk away, glancing back at the scene unfolding before them, but they couldn't stop staring. This wasn't just a regular crossing guard anymore. This man, this quiet, unassuming figure, was connected to something much larger than they could ever imagine. As they walked back toward the school, Jake couldn't help but wonder who was Mr. Daniels, and why was a helicopter landing in the middle of their small town for him. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that didn't make sense, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning of something much bigger. And whatever it was about to change everything they thought they knew. The days following the helicopter's sudden landing were nothing short of surreal. The kids, still in a state of shock from what they'd witnessed, couldn't stop talking about Mr. Daniels and the strange events. Word spread quickly around town, and before long nearly everyone had heard about the mysterious crossing guard. But no one could quite piece together what had really happened. School had resumed as normal the next day, but it was impossible to focus. Jake kept glancing toward the crosswalk, half expecting to see a group of agents in black suits or another helicopter circling the sky. But Mr. Daniels was back to his usual self, standing silently at his post, guiding the kids across the street with his unassuming air of authority. There was no hint of what had transpired the day before, no sign of the man in the suit, and no mention of the helicopter. It was as if it had all been a strange, fleeting dream. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had just happened, something that no one was talking about. It was as if the entire town had agreed without saying a word to pretend that it hadn't occurred. Every time he passed by Mr. Daniels, he couldn't help but wonder if the man was hiding something. Was he still just a quiet, ordinary crossing guard? Or was he involved in something much larger than any of them could comprehend? The most unsettling part of all was how the adults in town seemed to have suddenly forgotten about it. No one questioned the events of the day. No one asked why a helicopter had landed in the middle of a quiet street, or why a mysterious man had stepped out of it. It was as if the whole thing had been swept under the rug. Jake spent that week asking around, trying to find someone who knew what had really happened. But every answer he received was either vague or dismissive. The teachers at school would give him odd looks when he brought it up, and his friends only laughed, assuming he was still reeling from the shock. It was probably just a random thing they said. Maybe Mr. Daniels is just someone important, you know? But Jake wasn't so sure. The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. What was Mr. Daniels really doing there, standing on that corner day after day so quietly? And why had he been the one to attract the attention of a high-level government official? Jake knew he couldn't let it go. There was more to this story, more to Mr. Daniels than anyone realized. And as time went on, Jake began to wonder if he was the only one who had noticed. That afternoon, as he walked home past the crosswalk, Jake slowed his pace, looking over at Mr. Daniels, who greeted him with the same stoic smile. But this time, Jake noticed something different. A slight shift in Mr. Daniels' expression, as though he knew Jake was watching, knew that something was about to change. Jake's heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks that followed the flyover and the mysterious helicopter landing passed by in a blur for the people of the small town. But for Jake, it was like living in a world that no one else could see. As the days turned into months, whispers about Mr. Daniels. The quiet crossing guard began to fade from the public eye, and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. However, Jake could not let go of the questions that lingered in his mind. What was Mr. Daniels hiding? Why had a government official shown up for him? Why had he been so important that a helicopter had landed in their quiet little town? The truth, as Jake would soon learn, was far beyond anything he could have imagined. One fateful afternoon, Jake found himself in the local library idly scrolling through old newspapers on a microfilm reader. His mind wandered as he flipped through stories of local history, thinking of nothing in particular when something caught his eye, a name that seemed oddly familiar, Daniel Daniels. A single article stood out hidden among countless others. The headline read, "Former operative Daniel Daniels reported missing, after mission abroad." Jake's heart skipped a beat as he read through the article. The man described in the piece sounded remarkably like the quiet, unassuming Mr. Daniels, the crossing guard he'd grown to know. The article mentioned a covert operative who had been involved in top-secret missions for years, before he mysteriously disappeared, presumed dead. The name Daniel Daniels was familiar in a way that gave Jake chills. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of memory he had gathered. He'd seen Mr. Daniels wear strange military pins on his jacket, and his mannerisms were far too precise for someone just filling a basic role as a crossing guard. The more Jake read, the more unsettling the connection seemed. The article spoke of an operative who had infiltrated enemy lines, disrupted terrorist plots, and been part of one of the most dangerous covert teams the government had ever assembled. But there was no mention of his return, no mention of what happened to him after he disappeared. And that, Jake realized, was the key. Mr. Daniels had not been an ordinary person. He had been a ghost, someone who had disappeared from the world's eyes only to resurface in their small town under the guise of a humble, unnoticed crossing guard. Jake had always wondered why Mr. Daniels was so quiet, so unassuming, always standing still at his post, watching the world go by. But now he understood Mr. Daniels wasn't just any man. He was a former operative, a forgotten hero, who had lived through some of the most dangerous and high-stakes missions imaginable. The quiet life he now led was a deliberate choice one made to protect the world from the ghosts of his past. As the realization washed over Jake, he knew that the flyover, the helicopter, the sudden appearance of a government official, it was all connected to something much larger than anyone could have guessed. Mr. Daniels wasn't just a crossing guard. He was a man who had carried the weight of his legacy on his shoulders for years, and now it seemed that legacy was finally catching up with him. The revelation about Mr. Daniels hit Jake harder than he expected. For days he couldn't shake the image of the quiet crossing guard, a man who had seemingly lived an ordinary life in their small town, now revealed to be a former covert operative with a shadowy past. It felt like everything he thought he knew about the world had been turned upside down. The small acts of kindness that Mr. Daniels had shown, his soft smile and quiet demeanor, now took on a new weight. How many people, Jake wondered, passed by him every day without ever suspecting that he had once been part of something much larger and far more dangerous. Jake began to notice the way people in town looked at Mr. Daniels differently too. Before, he had been the friendly but distant figure, the man who greeted kids with a nod but never spoke much. Now there was an underlying respect, an unspoken understanding that there was more to him than met the eye. In some ways, this changed how Jake viewed the world as well. He started to realize how easily people could be underestimated, how easily the quiet and unassuming could slip under the radar, carrying with them histories far more complex than anyone could imagine. In the days that followed, Jake found himself reconsidering his own place in the world. He had always been a bit of a dreamer, unsure of where his life was headed, but after learning about Mr. Daniels' past, something shifted. It was as though he had been given a glimpse into a much bigger story, one that made him reconsider what it meant to be truly brave. Jake realized that bravery wasn't just about big dramatic actions. Sometimes it was about quietly doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. As he stood at the crossing guard post, watching the kids go by, Jake found himself inspired. Maybe he could do more with his life too. Not for the attention or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Like Mr. Daniels, he didn't need to be in the spotlight to make a difference. Sometimes it was the quietest people who left the biggest legacies.